The evening air was thick with tension as Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car outside the Capitol building. His dashboard clock showed 7:45 p.m., and the crowd of protesters had swelled to over 1,000. The radio crackled with increasing frequency as dispatch coordinated police positions around the perimeter. Reynolds watched through his windshield as protesters waved signs and chanted. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each passing minute. The department had anticipated this protest for weeks, but the sheer number of participants exceeded their estimates. Behind the police line, officers in riot gear stood ready, their presence creating a stark contrast against the civilian crowd. "All units, prepare to initiate crowd dispersal protocols," the radio announced. Reynolds acknowledged the call but remained in his vehicle, observing the dynamics of the crowd. After 15 years on the force, he had developed an instinct for reading protest situations. This one felt different. In the center of the gathering, a man's voice rose above the general clamor. Malik Carter, though Reynolds didn't recognize him yet, commanded attention without shouting. His words carried naturally across the square, reaching even those at the edges of the crowd. "We're not here to fight," Carter's voice rang out. "We're here to be heard. Our presence itself is our power." The crowd responded to Carter's words, their movements becoming more organized, more purposeful. Reynolds noticed how Carter's presence seemed to calm the more agitated protesters. He wore a simple blue suit, no tie, and moved through the crowd with natural authority. People made way for him, drawn to his message of unity and change. The situation shifted when a group of about 20 protesters broke away from the main crowd. They approached the police line, their body language aggressive. Reynolds received the order to exit his vehicle and join the line. He stepped out, adjusting his gear, but his movements were measured, reluctant. The breakaway group began shouting directly at the officers. Through his earpiece, Reynolds heard various units reporting escalating tensions around the perimeter. The protest was transforming from a peaceful demonstration into something more volatile. Behind the aggressive group, Carter was trying to reach them, calling for them to step back. "All units, advance and disperse," the command came through. Reynolds stood in formation with his fellow officers, but his training warred with his instincts. The aggressive group had positioned themselves between the police line and the main body of peaceful protesters. Any action against them would inevitably affect the entire crowd. Reynolds watched as other officers began moving forward. The breakaway group responded by pushing back, creating a dangerous pressure point between the two forces. Carter's voice could still be heard, now urgent, trying to prevent the impending clash. But the momentum had shifted, and the space between protesters and police had become a powder keg. The first plastic water bottle arced through the air, followed by others. Reynolds took a step forward with his unit, shield raised, even as his mind raced through potential alternatives. The aggressive group had effectively trapped the peaceful protesters behind them, turning the entire gathering into a potential conflict zone. As the line of officers prepared to advance, Reynolds' mind flashed back to his law school days, before he'd chosen the police academy instead. He remembered sitting next to James Martinez, now a prominent civil rights attorney, during their constitutional law class. Martinez's words from their last conversation echoed in his head: "The system doesn't need blind loyalty, Mark. It needs conscious guardians." The memory collided with present reality as Reynolds watched his fellow officers tighten their formation. The department had updated their crowd control protocols just last month, but the new guidelines seemed inadequate for the complexity of this situation. Through the gaps between shields, he could see protesters linking arms, creating human chains. In the midst of the chaos, Malik Carter maneuvered through the crowd, his blue suit now visible in the fading daylight. He raised his hands, attempting to create a buffer zone between the aggressive protesters and the police line. "Everyone, step back." Carter's voice carried authority, but the mounting tension had created its own momentum. Officer Wilson, a rookie positioned to Reynolds' right, suddenly broke protocol. Without warning, he stepped forward and shoved Carter, clearly not recognizing the vice governor. The push sent Carter stumbling backward into other protesters, creating a ripple effect through the crowd. The situation, already precarious, exploded. The crowd surged forward in response to Carter's treatment. Reynolds found himself caught in the automated response of his training. The line of officers advanced as one unit, shields up, forcing their way into the crowd. The distinction between aggressive protesters and peaceful demonstrators disappeared in the chaos. Commands blared through Reynolds' earpiece, but they mixed with the roar of the crowd. He could see Carter trying to regain his footing, still attempting to calm both sides. But the momentum of the police advance, combined with the crowd's reaction, created a crushing pressure at the point of contact. Reynolds, operating on instinct and training, swung his baton to clear a path. In that critical moment, he didn't register that the figure in front of him was Carter. The vice governor had turned to help someone who had fallen, presenting his back to the advancing police line. Reynolds' baton connected with Carter's shoulder, sending him sprawling onto the concrete. The impact seemed to create a moment of suspended time. Reynolds watched as Carter fell, surrounded by gasping protesters who recognized their leader. The vice governor's glasses skittered across the pavement, and a small trickle of blood appeared at his temple where he'd struck the ground. Horror dawned on Reynolds' face as recognition set in. Around them, phones recorded the incident from multiple angles. Carter's supporters rushed to form a protective circle around him, while others pointed at Reynolds, their phones capturing his badge number. The chants of protest transformed into cries of outrage. Martinez's words from years ago cut through Reynolds' shock. The hardest part isn't knowing what's right, it's doing what's right when everything around you pulls the other way. As Carter was helped to his feet, his eyes met Reynolds for a brief moment. In that exchange, both men seemed to recognize that this incident would become much larger than either of them. Within hours, social media exploded with footage of the incident. The hashtag Justice for Carter trended nationwide as multiple videos showed different angles of the vice governor's assault. Each clip revealed new details: Carter's raised hands, his attempt to de-escalate, and the sudden violence of the police response. News channels ran the footage on continuous loops, with political commentators dissecting every frame. Malik Carter lay in his hospital bed, watching the coverage on a wall-mounted TV. The doctors had diagnosed him with a mild concussion and a bruised shoulder. But the physical injuries paled compared to the symbolic weight now thrust upon him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from activists, politicians, and media outlets, all demanding statements or interviews. In his apartment across town, Mark Reynolds sat alone in his darkened living room, still in his uniform, replaying the incident in his mind. His TV showed the same footage, but he couldn't bring himself to watch it again. The department had already placed him on administrative leave pending investigation. His phone contained dozens of missed calls from fellow officers, some offering support, others demanding explanations. James Martinez's latest text message glowed on Reynolds' phone screen: "You need legal representation. This isn't going away." Reynolds knew his former classmate was right, but admitting that meant accepting the magnitude of what he'd done. The police union had already offered to provide lawyers, but their support felt suffocating rather than reassuring. At the hospital, Aisha Carter arrived after finishing emergency meetings with community leaders. She found her husband attempting to draft a public statement on his laptop. "You need to rest," she insisted, but Malik kept typing. The incident had transformed from a personal injury into a pivotal moment for their cause. "They're trying to spin this," Aisha said, showing Malik her phone. Already, certain media outlets were questioning why the vice governor had been at a protest instead of doing his job. Others suggested he had provoked the police response. The narrative battle had begun before Malik could even leave his hospital bed. Malik paused his typing, looking at his wife. "If we don't control this story, they will," he said, wincing as he adjusted his position. "But it's bigger than just what happened to me. It's about every person who's ever faced this kind of violence without cameras present." Back in his apartment, Reynolds received a call from his captain. "The union lawyers want you to say you didn't recognize the vice governor and that you followed standard crowd control procedures," the captain explained. "They think we can weather this." Reynolds remained silent, remembering the look in Carter's eyes as their gazes met after the incident. Aisha paced the hospital room, her legal training kicking in. "We need to file charges," she insisted. "Not just against Reynolds, but against the department. Make this about systemic change, not individual accountability." Malik nodded slowly, understanding that his next moves would affect not just his political career but the entire movement for police reform. The night deepened, but neither man slept. In different parts of the city, both Carter and Reynolds grappled with decisions that would define not only their futures but potentially reshape their community. Social media continued to churn, protests grew larger outside the hospital, and the machinery of political power began to move, sensing opportunity in the chaos. Senator Richard Hayes sat in his office, watching the footage of Carter's assault for the 10th time. His political strategist, Linda Morgan, stood by his desk, "This is our chance," Hayes said, pausing the video. "Carter's been a thorn in our side on police funding. We can use this to paint him as an agitator rather than a victim." Within hours, Hayes' office began releasing carefully crafted statements questioning Carter's presence at the protest. "A vice governor should lead from his office, not from the streets," Hayes told reporters. His team leaked selective parts of Carter's past speeches, taken out of context, suggesting a history of anti-police rhetoric. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds sat in James Martinez's law office, the weight of his decisions visible in his hunched shoulders. "The union lawyers want me to stick to the script," Reynolds explained. "Say I was following protocols, that it was dark, that I couldn't identify Carter in the chaos." Martinez leaned forward across his desk. "But that's not what's eating at you, is it?" he asked. Reynolds shook his head, remembering their law school discussions about police reform. The irony wasn't lost on him, he'd become exactly what they'd once criticized. Across town, community leaders gathered in the First Baptist Church's basement. The meeting, called by Reverend Thompson, quickly revealed deep divisions. Some leaders demanded immediate protests, while others advocated for working within the system. The tension in the room reflected larger fractures within the movement. "We can't let them divide us," Reverend Thompson urged, but the arguments continued. Some younger activists accused the older generation of being too cautious, while established leaders worried about losing public support through aggressive actions. Back at his office, Hayes received polling data showing a split in public opinion. While the video evidence seemed damning, his team's narrative about Carter's judgment was gaining traction among certain demographics. Hayes smiled, knowing that doubt was all he needed to sow. Reynolds left Martinez's office with more questions than answers. His partner, Officer Sarah Chen, waited outside. "The whole department's watching you, Mark," she warned. "Whatever you decide affects all of us." Her words highlighted the impossible position he found himself in, choosing between loyalty to his colleagues and his conscience. In the church basement, the meeting reached a critical point when Marcus Young, a prominent business leader, spoke up. "We need to think strategically," he argued. "Filing a lawsuit makes this about one incident. We need systemic change." Others disagreed, saying they couldn't let this specific instance of brutality go unpunished. The debate was interrupted by breaking news. Hayes had just given an interview suggesting Carter had orchestrated the incident for political gain. The accusation was baseless, but the mere suggestion sent shockwaves through the room. The community leaders watched their phones light up with messages, realizing that the battle for narrative control was escalating. Hayes' political machine worked through the night, feeding stories to sympathetic media outlets. Each piece carefully questioned Carter's judgment while expressing concern for his injuries. It was a masterclass in political manipulation, turning victim into villain through subtle implications and carefully worded statements. Jamal Washington emerged as a powerful voice in the aftermath of Carter's assault. At 25, his social media presence had already made him a recognizable figure in activist circles. His live streams from outside the hospital drew thousands of viewers as he called for direct action against police brutality. "We're done asking nicely," Jamal declared to his followers. "Vice Governor Carter's blood is on that concrete, and they want us to stay calm." His words resonated particularly with younger protesters, who were tired of what they saw as incremental progress through traditional channels. Malik Carter watched Jamal's live streams from his hospital bed, recognizing both the young man's passion and the potential dangers of his approach. The vice governor had spent years building coalitions, working within the system while pushing for change. Jamal's calls for direct confrontation threatened to undermine that delicate balance. The division became clear during a strategy meeting at the hospital. Jamal had been invited as a representative of the youth movement, but his presence created immediate tension. "With all due respect, sir," he addressed Carter, "your moderate approach got you beaten by the same system you're trying to reform." Carter sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "And what do you propose instead, Jamal? More violence? More confrontation?" We'd be playing right into Hayes' narrative. But Jamal was prepared for this argument. He pulled out his phone, showing a live feed of protests erupting in other cities in response to Carter's assault. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds received the official summons to testify about the incident. The document sat on his kitchen table like a live grenade. The union lawyers had already prepared a statement for him, a carefully worded account that would protect both him and the department. But Martinez's words haunted him. "The truth has a way of demanding to be heard." Jamal's proposed march would take protesters directly past police headquarters during shift change, a deliberately provocative choice. When Carter heard the plan, he understood the symbolic power of the gesture, but also its potential for disaster. "You're asking for another confrontation," he warned Jamal. "Maybe that's exactly what we need," Jamal responded, his voice firm. "They need to see we're not afraid." The younger activists in the room nodded in agreement, while older community leaders exchanged worried glances. The generational divide was becoming a chasm. Reynolds spent hours staring at the summons, knowing his testimony could either maintain the status quo or help force genuine change. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others subtly threatening. The thin blue line had never felt more like a noose. As the day progressed, Jamal's march gained momentum on social media. Thousands pledged to attend, including activists from neighboring states. Carter watched the situation spinning beyond his control, caught between his role as a government official and his commitment to the cause. Hayes' office was already preparing statements about professional agitators and outside influences. The inevitability of confrontation hung in the air like an approaching storm. Jamal's followers grew more numerous and more determined, while the police department increased its riot preparation. Carter found himself in the impossible position of trying to prevent violence while supporting the legitimate anger of his community. Malik Carter held a private meeting with the ACLU and prominent civil rights attorneys in his hospital room, now converted into an impromptu war room. Medical charts and legal documents covered his bed tray as they discussed strategy. "We need to approach this systematically," Carter explained. "Not just my case, but using it to expose the entire pattern of departmental misconduct." The legal team had already compiled a decade's worth of excessive force complaints against the department. Most had been dismissed or settled quietly, but together they painted a damning picture of institutional failure. Carter's case would be the keystone that could bring the whole structure into question. Senator Hayes called an emergency press conference on the Capitol steps. Surrounded by carefully selected supporters, including 2 retired black police officers, he launched his attack. "Vice Governor Carter has consistently undermined law enforcement," Hayes declared. "This incident, while regrettable, is the natural result of his inflammatory rhetoric and reckless behavior." The press conference was calculated to dominate the news cycle. Hayes presented edited clips of Carter's past speeches, stripped of context, making his calls for police accountability sound like calls for anti-police violence. Behind the scenes, Hayes' team had already arranged for friendly commentators to flood the airwaves with their interpretation of events. Mark Reynolds watched the press conference from his living room, feeling sick. The senator's words bore no resemblance to the reality he had witnessed, yet here was the narrative being constructed in real time. His phone rang, the union lawyer again, pressuring him to align his testimony with the department's version of events. At the hospital, Carter's legal team worked to counter Hayes' narrative. They prepared a detailed timeline of the incident, supported by multiple video angles, witness statements, and Carter's own history of peaceful advocacy. But they knew they were fighting an uphill battle against a well-oiled political machine. "We need to file the lawsuit now," Carter's lead attorney advised. "Before Hayes can solidify his narrative." The legal documents were ready, a comprehensive lawsuit targeting not just Reynolds and the department, but the entire system of police oversight and accountability. Reynolds turned off his TV and drove to the precinct, taking back roads to avoid reporters. In the locker room, he found himself alone, staring at his reflection in the small mirror. The image of Carter falling played on repeat in his mind, along with Hayes' lies about what had happened. Something inside him shifted. The lawsuit was filed the next morning. Carter held a press conference from his hospital room, his injured shoulder visible beneath his suit jacket. Unlike Hayes' emotional appeals, Carter stuck to facts. He presented clear evidence, including new footage that showed him actively trying to de-escalate the situation before being struck. "This isn't about me," Carter stated firmly. "This is about every citizen's right to protest without fear of violence. It's about holding our institutions accountable to the people they serve." His words, measured but powerful, provided a stark contrast to Hayes' inflammatory rhetoric. Hayes' office scrambled to respond, but the evidence was harder to dismiss than they'd anticipated. Multiple videos from different angles left little room for alternative interpretations. The senator's attempts to paint Carter as an agitator began to backfire as more witnesses came forward. In the community center's main hall, Malik Carter faced a divided audience. Local business owners, religious leaders, and longtime activists filled the rows of chairs, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and frustration. The proposed march, now gaining national attention, had become a flashpoint of controversy. "We can't afford another violent confrontation," argued Marcus Thompson, owner of a local pharmacy that had barely survived previous protests. "Our community needs healing, not more conflict." Several other business owners nodded in agreement, their memories of broken windows and insurance battles still fresh. Carter stood at the podium, his injured shoulder a visible reminder of what was at stake. "I understand your fears," he acknowledged, "but we also can't afford to let this moment pass without meaningful change." His words carried the weight of someone who had paid a physical price for his convictions. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds sat in the Internal Affairs office, facing his fellow officers. The pressure to maintain the blue wall of silence was palpable. "Think about your career," his sergeant advised. "Think about your pension." But Reynolds was thinking about something else, the look in Carter's eyes as he fell, the truth buried under Hayes' lies. Across town, Aisha Carter organized a fundraising event at the historic Lincoln Hotel. The venue choice was deliberate. It had once refused service to black customers, and now it would host an event supporting civil rights. But as she worked the phones, she encountered resistance from unexpected quarters. "Your husband's pushing too hard," one longtime supporter told her. "We need to work within the system." Aisha gripped her phone tighter, remembering the sight of her husband in the hospital bed. "The system is what put him there," she responded, ending the call. Reynolds finally made his decision. Standing up in the Internal Affairs office, he announced his intention to testify truthfully about the incident. The room fell silent. His partner, Officer Chen, followed him out. "You're committing career suicide," she warned. Reynolds kept walking, Martinez's words about moral courage echoing in his mind. The community meeting reached its climax when young activist Sarah Jenkins stood up. "While we debate, they're preparing to silence us again," she declared. "The vice governor's assault wasn't an accident, it was a message. Are we going to send one back, or just keep playing it safe?" Carter watched the room divide further, understanding that each passing day made reconciliation harder. The moderate voices were being drowned out by calls for more aggressive action. Even his own supporters were beginning to question whether his measured approach was still viable. At the fundraiser preparation, Aisha received more disturbing news. Several major donors had pulled out, citing concerns about escalating tensions. Hayes' narrative was working. People were beginning to see advocacy for police accountability as equivalent to promoting violence. The day ended with both Carter and Reynolds making crucial decisions. Carter decided to publicly support the march while working behind the scenes to ensure peaceful protocols. Reynolds, having burned his bridges with the department, reached out to Martinez to prepare his testimony. Neither man slept well, knowing the next few days would determine not just their futures, but the direction of the entire movement. The morning of the march arrived with tension hanging thick in the air. News helicopters circled overhead as Jamal led the first wave of protesters down Central Avenue. Behind him, thousands gathered, their signs and voices creating a sea of determined resistance. Malik Carter, against his doctor's advice, stood on the steps of the courthouse, preparing to address the crowd. Police barricades lined the route, with officers in riot gear positioned at strategic points. Among them, Mark Reynolds watched from the sidelines, now in civilian clothes, having been suspended pending his testimony. He noticed the tactical units positioned on rooftops and the undercover officers dispersed throughout the crowd, preparations that the public couldn't see. Carter's speech began with measured tones. "Today, we march not just for justice in one case, but for transformation of an entire system." His injured shoulder was still in a sling, a visible reminder of why they had gathered. The crowd's energy shifted as he spoke, finding unity in his words despite their different approaches to activism. The situation deteriorated when a group of counter-protesters emerged from a side street, carrying signs supporting Senator Hayes and the police department. The two groups converged near police headquarters, exactly where Jamal had planned the most provocative part of the march. Officers tensed, hands moving to their gear. "Stay peaceful." Carter's voice rang out through the megaphone, but the growing tension had its own momentum. Someone from the counter-protest threw a water bottle, striking a young protester. The response was immediate, pushing, shoving, and sudden chaos erupted at the intersection. Reynolds watched in horror as the scene began to mirror the night of Carter's assault. Police units moved forward in formation, while protesters linked arms to hold their ground. Jamal stood at the front lines, live streaming everything, his voice rising above the chaos. The whole world is watching. Again. Carter forced his way through the crowd, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He positioned himself between the police line and the protesters, much like he had on the night he was injured. This time, though, his presence was unmistakable. Officers hesitated, recognizing him, remembering the consequences of the previous confrontation. The moment hung in balance. Reynolds, seeing history about to repeat itself, made a decision. He pushed through the police line, joining Carter in the neutral space between the groups. His presence, a suspended officer standing with the vice governor, created a powerful image that immediately went viral. "This is what change looks like," Carter announced, gesturing to Reynolds beside him. Not violence, not surrender, but the courage to stand together and admit when the system needs reform. The tension began to deflate as both protesters and police processed the symbolism of the moment. Jamal, seeing the impact, adjusted his message in real time. His live stream captured the gradual de-escalation, proving that peaceful resolution was possible. The counter-protesters, losing momentum and media attention, began to disperse. The march continued, but now with a different energy, less confrontational, more purposeful. The first direct encounter between Carter and Reynolds since the incident occurred in the courthouse hallway before Reynolds' scheduled testimony. The corridor fell silent as the two men faced each other, their unexpected meeting captured by waiting journalists. Carter's shoulder brace and Reynolds' civilian clothes marked how much had changed since that fateful night. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Reynolds said quietly, aware of the cameras but speaking only to Carter. The vice governor studied the former officer's face, seeing not the uniformed figure who had struck him, but a man grappling with the weight of his choices. "Sometimes," Carter responded, "the right path only becomes clear after we've taken the wrong one." Their conversation was interrupted by breaking news that exploded across social media. A whistleblower from Hayes' office had leaked emails revealing a coordinated effort to exploit the incident. The messages showed Hayes and police leadership discussing ways to discredit Carter months before the assault, anticipating an opportunity to undermine his police reform initiatives. The leaked emails included detailed plans to infiltrate peaceful protests with agitators, creating situations that would justify aggressive police responses. More damaging were discussions about using Carter's eventual reaction to such incidents to paint him as anti-police. The timestamps proved these conversations predated the assault by weeks. Carter's legal team quickly incorporated the new evidence into their case. The revelation transformed what had appeared to be a single incident of police brutality into evidence of systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of state government. Hayes' carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. "We need to move quickly," Carter told his advisors, knowing Hayes would attempt to contain the damage. "This isn't just about police reform anymore. It's about exposing corruption at every level." His team began preparing for an expanded investigation that would encompass both the police department and Hayes' office. Reynolds, preparing for his testimony, received an unexpected visit from Officer Chen. She brought more evidence, internal memos showing how Hayes' office had pressured the police department to maintain aggressive crowd control tactics, despite concerns from officers about escalating tensions. "They used us as pawns," Chen said, sliding the documents across the table. The ripples spread through the political establishment. Several of Hayes' key allies began distancing themselves, sensing the shifting political winds. The senator's office released a statement claiming the emails were taken out of context, but more whistleblowers came forward, each with new pieces of the puzzle. Carter seized the moment to push for comprehensive reform. Speaking from the courthouse steps, he outlined a plan that went beyond police accountability to address the political structures that enabled abuse of power. "The system doesn't just need adjustment," he declared. "It needs transformation." Reynolds watched Carter's speech on the courthouse television, waiting to be called to testify. The evidence he had prepared to share about the night of the assault now felt like just one piece of a larger picture. His testimony would help expose not just what happened that night, but why it had been allowed to happen. The courthouse was packed for Reynolds' testimony. Every seat was filled, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. Senator Hayes sat in the front row, his usual confidence replaced by visible concern. Carter and Aisha were present, seated directly across the aisle, their presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. Reynolds approached the witness stand, his former colleagues watching intently from their section of the gallery. Officer Chin sat among them, the leaked documents secure in her briefcase. The air felt heavy with anticipation as Reynolds raised his right hand to take the oath. His testimony began with the night of the assault, but quickly expanded to reveal a broader pattern. Reynolds described systematic pressure from above to escalate responses to peaceful protests, specifically targeting Carter's appearances. He detailed meetings where officers were instructed to create situations that would discredit reform advocates. "We were told it was about maintaining order," Reynolds testified, his voice steady. "But looking back, we were being used to silence voices of change." He then produced emails and memos documenting how Hayes' office had manipulated police department policies to serve political ends. As Reynolds spoke, Hayes was observed hastily leaving the courtroom. News would break hours later that federal investigators had launched a corruption probe into his office. The senator's carefully constructed political machine was unraveling in real time. Carter listened to the testimony with growing understanding of how close Hayes had come to succeeding. The plan to discredit him had been comprehensive, from infiltrating protests to coordinating with sympathetic media outlets. Only the ubiquity of phone cameras and the courage of whistleblowers had prevented it from working. The hearing concluded with an unexpected moment. Reynolds, finishing his testimony, turned to directly address Carter. "I had a choice that night," he said, "and I made the wrong one. But we all have another choice now, to be part of the problem or part of the solution." The gallery fell silent, absorbing the weight of his words. In the aftermath, Carter and Reynolds found themselves working together, though in very different roles. Carter launched a comprehensive police reform initiative, while Reynolds began conducting training sessions on ethical decision-making for law enforcement officers. Their unlikely alliance became a powerful symbol of possibility. Jamal, who had initially called for more radical action, found a way to channel his passion into sustainable change. He joined Carter's reform committee, representing a younger generation's perspective while learning to work within the system to transform it. The final scene played out months later at a community reconciliation event. Carter and Reynolds stood together on stage, addressing a mixed audience of activists, police officers, and community members. "Change doesn't come from tearing each other down," Carter declared, "but from finding the courage to stand up together." The story concluded with the passage of the Carter-Reynolds Police Accountability Act, a comprehensive reform bill that would become a model for other states. It represented not just policy change, but a new understanding that true justice requires both accountability and reconciliation. Hayes resigned in disgrace, facing multiple federal indictments. But more importantly, the movement he had tried to destroy emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. The night of violence that he had hoped would divide the community had instead become the catalyst for meaningful change. As Carter often said in later speeches, sometimes the worst moments bring out the best in us, if we have the courage to learn from them and the wisdom to grow together. The image of Carter and Reynolds, once adversaries, now standing together as advocates for change, became a powerful symbol of that truth.